Hello and welcome to this launch event for a suicide prevention campaign here on Vashon Island. I'm your host, Susan McCabe, and I will be moderating today's event, coming to you from the stage at Vashon Center for the Arts. And I want to thank our technical and crew teams here making all this possible for you to see online on Facebook and at the VashonCenterForTheArts.org website. The Suicide Prevention Campaign is a collaboration between VashonBePrepared, the Medical Reserve Corps, and Vashon Fire and Rescue. You're going to hear a lot about this campaign in the next few weeks. I encourage you to watch Island Media and find out about events subsequent to this one. So, why are we doing this now? It seems almost a silly question, but we're still under pandemic restrictions that keep us isolated from family and friends. The dark northwest winter will soon be upon us, restricting our access to the outdoors, to human contact, and to the solace of nature. And even nature now seems to be attacking us. So that's a good why. Why Vashon? Well, September is Neighbor Month, and Vashonians are all about taking care of one another. Vashon's average age is 55, which is statistically the highest risk age group for suicide. Rural areas like ours report 40% higher rates of suicide than metropolitan areas. Our distance from emergency medical care increases the risk of dying by suicide. And according to Vashon Community Care Team Leader Jenna Risdahl, we face a potentially grave threat as the pandemic drags on. We don't know how long this is going to last. And we are already seeing a surge in substance abuse, domestic abuse, loneliness, and depression, and it feels like there's no end in sight. All these mental health challenges can build up to deadly consequences. So we're aiming to get ahead of this threat by focusing initially on suicide prevention. Here's how we're going to spend the next hour together. We'll hear some compelling stories and observations from our panelists about suicide, its causes, and its impacts. And we'll discuss issues around suicide as they arise. Most important, our panelists will offer some tools for families as well as mental health professionals to help us all practice suicide prevention during this especially pressing time. Once our panelists have told their stories, we'll invite you in our audience to ask questions. You can do that in the comment section if you're watching on Facebook, or in the chat section of our Vimeo broadcast at the VashonCenterForTheArts.org website. Members of our team will deliver those questions to me so I may address them to our panelists. So let's get started. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Dr. John Osborne. He is a well-known and respected island physician who lost his nephew to suicide 7 years ago. Welcome, John. Thank you for telling us your story.
Thanks, Susan. First, I'd like to just start by saying something to all of you that I say to my patients in the emergency room who are struggling with depression, and that is one thing that you can do is pull out your smartphone and put in the crisis telephone line, plug it into your directory in your phone, 1-800-273-TALK, 8255. Or if you're a texter, 741-741, and put in the words HEAL. It's a simple thing. And every time I tell a patient that in the emergency room, I tell them a little bit about CAM. 7 years ago on Monday, I got up, I was on my way to the hospital, and I picked up the messages on my phone. And the first message was from a police officer saying, I'm calling for Dr. Osborne on behalf of your sister, Debbie. and there was nothing more. And the second message was from Debbie, my sister, and she told me that Cameron, one of her two sons, was dead by suicide. So I was in Spokane, and Debbie and her husband Stuart and their surviving son Nate were in Boise. So I got Rachel up, my wife, and told her, and so I was on the plane, the first plane to Boise to help. It's been a long journey in these 7 years. I think initially it was just, I can't convey how devastating Cam's loss was. He's 17 years old, incredibly talented actor, singer, beloved by his fellow students, and just the loss for our family and for our community, for the fellow students, was just horrendous. I think my dad was in hospice at the time, and trying to help my dad, who was at the end of his life, understand what had just happened to his beloved grandson was a real struggle. I think in the aftermath, there were many things that we did. One thing was to put together a healing plan for Debbie and Stuart. They worked with a local physician who had lost 3 of his children to suicide, and they were part of a counseling group. And then, but also just, kind of rallying the family and the community to support them. And even still today, it's, we're at the 7th anniversary this week of Cam's loss, and just suicide anniversaries are incredibly difficult for our family and others. In the aftermath, I think, Stuart in particular, Cam's dad, stepped forward and has become a leader in suicide prevention in Idaho. Idaho has the 5th highest suicide rate in the country. And I think, as Susan mentioned, rural areas in particular, particularly in the West, are particularly vulnerable. But Stuart has kind of really stepped forward, as Debbie have. I think one of the big challenges in those first days was just, do you tell the truth? Do you tell the world that your son has just died by suicide? And so just something like writing the obituary, the struggle. But to their credit, they were honest. And I think that honesty, that integrity has carried them forward. And in doing so, their willingness to step forward and talk about Cam's loss has really been at the core of at least part of the core of the effort in Idaho to prevent youth suicide in that state. I met up with Jen Stuber, who and Marnie Lombard, both of whom lost family members to suicide. I think one point here is that survivors of suicide or suicide survivors are really often the drivers of policy reform and the efforts to prevent suicide among high-risk demographics. So, even though I had been dealing with my dad's suicide and Cam's loss, I got recruited to testify at the state legislature. And so I testified at both the House and the Senate on the need for all health professionals who are credentialed in Washington State to have suicide prevention training as a condition of licensure. So all of you who complain about having to take those hours of suicide prevention training, it is driven by those of us who have lost family members to suicide, and in part because our family members did not get the care that they needed at the time when they needed it. So,
John, thank you.
Thank you.
At this point, I'd like to include Dr. Barry Grosskopf in our conversation. He is a retired family practice physician, psychiatrist, and author of Hidden in Plain Sight, Getting to the Bottom of Puzzling Emotions. Barry, as you were listening to John's story, what questions came to your mind?
Well, the one that always drives me is what the hell happened and how did it happen? I think, that being a teenager is one of the most stressful times of life. It's an awful time where a person is first getting their feet into adulthood. And it's a frightening kind of task. All you have are other people to look to see how to do this. And an individual's own unruly feelings doesn't necessarily fit into the proper mold. And so it's a highly conformist time, and people don't conform to the boxes that they think they're supposed to be in. And that discrepancy makes a lot of teenagers very anxious and very depressed. What I would urge all the teenagers out there is to really find someone to talk to. Don't be hidden, like John was emphasizing, honesty. Don't be hidden with those questions that you may have about who you are, what your sexuality may be. All these things are yet to be determined, and it's all okay once you get old enough to know that you're just fine the way you are. That was the main questions I had, and I really appreciated John's honesty and the pursuit of this subject for everyone. It's those among us who have been most hurt that need to be the canaries to speak up so that we can start rectifying things in our own world that need to be fixed.
Yeah, the world tells us that your teenage years are the best years of your life, and that's one of the first big lies. It's not.
My wife tells her students, this is the worst years of your life.
That's right.
And it gets better.
And John, looking back, were there signs of Cam's depression or of his potential suicide?
Yes.
What were they?
Well, I think Cam was depressed and struggled with depression. He was also a prolific texter, and so when after he died and Stuart and Debbie had a chance to look at his phone, I think they were pretty stunned at the amount of texting that had gone on. And I think for those of you who text, when you come across the warnings, I mean, if the warnings are clearly there, it's kind of, if you see something, say something, because you may not have another chance, and there wasn't for Cameron.
Yeah, the warning signs, and I was going to bring this up later, but the template that our Vashon Be Prepared folks and the suicide prevention campaign is going to use is this LEARN, and it starts with, LEARN is an acronym, and it starts with look for the signs. And if you look here on our board, the signs are hopelessness, depression, anxiety, feeling like a burden to others, social withdrawal, isolation, sleep problems, alcohol or drug use, loss, rejection, or humiliation, giving away possessions, and talking about death. So some of those may have shown up with Cam, or maybe showing up with some friend of yours that you may know. And Barry, in your experience, are most teen suicides impulse actions?
I think most of them are impulsive. It's a highly impulsive time. Things seem like they're going to be forever. There is no way out, and people will do impulsive things. I don't know if that was true for Cam.
It was.
Well, so for Cam,
John,
too.
thank you.
He had been
Thank you
depressed
both.
for a long time.
Let's move on to our next speaker, and he is Bill Burnett Forgive me. Did I say that right?
Yeah,
Burnett.
yeah.
He's a former IT professional turned motivational speaker, and I recommend his TED Talk. It's very good. And he is a survivor of his own suicide attempt. Bill, will you tell us your story?
Sure. I was sitting on a blue flannel blanket on a bed in an emergency room when just waiting to be released so I could go home because I was sure I was fine. When I declined a doctor's invitation to stay in their behavioral health unit on suicide watch, and I actually thought it was an invitation. I felt kind of bad for her, like, oh, that is so sweet. But it turned out to be like more of an FYI, you're going here. And my big worry at the time wasn't saving my life. My big worry was that I had this big project I was leading at the bank where I worked in IT, and we had a big rollout, and I wasn't going to be on site to oversee it. So that was my big worry as I went in, and I was there for about 5 days, and I got a bipolar diagnosis. I'd had one before, and I hadn't taken it too seriously, and this time I also didn't take it very seriously. I got out of there, and I didn't really accept ongoing treatment. I was basically worked my way out of the requirements as quickly as I could, and so that's the impact of mental health stigma. That's the impact that stigma had on me, right? I had a chance here to shift my life, and I had no interest in doing that because I was too embarrassed to think that maybe I had a problem I couldn't fix on my own. And so I continued to get worse. And in addition to the bipolar condition, I had an addiction problem. So I was really kind of in a tailspin for a number of years, and I lost everything. And so about 8 years after that first hospital stay, I got a second invitation. This time, though, I really was kind of like, yeah, you're right. I should probably just go here. And so I was in the hospital for a second time for a suicide attempt. And I can tell you the exact moment that my life started to transform, started to shift from this sort of hopeless suffering to starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could have a good life. And what happened was I was sitting having dinner, or actually because it was after dinner, but it was in this big hygienic dining area. And there's one other patient, and I was talking to her, and we were sharing our stories. Another suicide attempt survivor was her reason for being there. And we were sharing our stories and kind of explaining what was going on in our lives and what were the events that had led us there and what did we think might happen next. And we were even kind of smiling, nodding, even laughing a little bit in spite of how dark our circumstances were. Because, you know, in spite of the difficulty of our depressions, there's still this amazing joy in human connection when two people connect. And for me, my condition, my addiction, my depression, all of those things, my behavior, had really led to me feeling completely like an outsider, like literally like I was an outsider on the entire planet. I just didn't belong anywhere, fit in at all. And after that conversation, I started to feel like, hey, I belong. There are other people like me. And I started talking to other people there and like, wow, these people are smart. They're funny. They're kind. They're super resilient. These are cool people. And so that was a big shift for me. I left there, and it's not like I turned my life around immediately. It took some time, but I did start to turn it around. And over the next several years, I got clean from addiction. I'll have 12 years, knock on wood, next month, clean from addiction. And then a few years after I got clean, maybe 2 or 3 years from addiction, I started to work on my mental health because I was like, oh, quitting drugs didn't result in automatic happiness. And I was actually kind of pissed off about that. But that's a very common thing for recovering addicts. Like, oh, now I'm clean. Oh, now it's life. That's why I was getting high in the first place. So right. I had to deal with that. And That's its own journey, that everybody's going to have their own path through it. So what worked for me may or may not work for other people. But the important point that I want to make in my talk here today is that it was possible to have shifts that I thought were impossible, right? I was able to transform my life from absolute, some just horrible addiction to living clean, from this just awful isolation to learning how to overcome social anxiety that I'd had my whole life and be comfortable around people and learn how to interact. And I was able to shift from like living in that horrible, hopeless depression, like this bone-chilling, body-numbing depression. Those of you who've been there, you know what I'm talking about. The rest of you can imagine it maybe. But to live in that like almost every day, to, yes, I do get depressed today sometimes, but I have tools. I've built up some things around self-care, like a mindfulness practice, and I have a very big support network, and I don't mind telling you, I had to reach out to them this summer. It's been a very challenging year for a lot of us, and but I did have those tools in place, and so I was able to move forward in a really positive way when I had a hard time. So that kind of journey is possible, and the remarkable thing about my story is that it's not extraordinary. The remarkable thing is that it's really ordinary. People transform their lives every day. So that's why I'm here, and that's why I really appreciate you being here and all of you putting this event on, because the word doesn't get out there. I happen to be somebody who speaks out about these things because I'm passionate about it, but there are a lot of people who transform their lives and they're just not public speakers or writers or whatever, so you never hear about it. But people live in kind of this hellish existence for years or decades, and then they're able to change those patterns of thought and behavior and have a better life. And people who really believe they don't belong and will never fit in learn that they actually have belonged the whole time, and there was nothing they needed to do to fit in because there's a ton of other people just like them. And that's that human connection point, right? Depression and anxiety are hard, but they're very human experiences, and we can connect. Whether or not we can solve them right away for somebody, that's a whole other question. I'm saying if you have these things, it's like a ticket. It's a golden ticket to connect with other people, because so many other people have these things, and they're so foundational to our basic psyche that it's just a deep, real, genuine connection that's available to everybody right now. So if I could give you one message, it would be to reach out, or if you're struggling, or to reach in if somebody else is. I know John talked about this, and I've been doing a lot of reading of articles, what's going on around World Suicide Prevention Day. And the one thing I see advocates all around the world say over and over is if you're worried about somebody, that if you ask them if they're having thoughts of suicide, it's not going to put the idea into their head, and it's not going to increase their risk. So it's perfectly fine to ask them, but you can start a lot smaller. Like the Veterans Crisis Line has a Be There campaign where they say, hey, just like text somebody, check in, see if they want to get lunch. How are you doing? Give them a call. Just like reach out and support in a subtle way is a really easy thing to do too. So I can't tell you how you like to connect or what works for you in your life. I can just tell you that connection is available, and it's one of the most powerful things, and it's free too. So
thank you, Bill. Thank you so much. And I'm wondering, as I listen to you, how many folks you have reached through your TED Talk. And another thing comes to my mind, and that is that there are so many people out there experiencing what you experienced, feeling alone, feeling like outcasts. And the first thing that comes to my mind is that this culture does not encourage vulnerability among us. And I'd like to bring Barry into the discussion again now. What thoughts came to your mind when you were listening to Bill?
Well, again, always I'm interested in the genesis of things, and I wondered, did you have some early traumas or losses when you were young or during adolescence?
Yeah. I won't go into the specifics, but I threatened to kill myself when I was 8. I was depressive from a very young age.
So there's in Bavaria there was a town that by culture and custom would name the child of parents who was born after the death of another child. They'd be called Erdemude, the sorrow of the earth, because that child was being raised by the sorrow of the parent, and the person was being loved in grief as well as with embrace. And for so many people, moods seem to come out of the blue. And I've wondered through much of my career how much of those moods that come out of the blue are like a post-traumatic expression, like a child whose mother is depressed and can't be there for the child for an extended period of time, whether that happened because somebody in her life had died or whether there's some depression going on for her. That child will suddenly get depressed in a way that makes no sense out of the person's own experience. And it's an experience that it comes back like a flashback to an older period. And the fact that you're here and you're speaking when the whole world of depression is saying this is permanent, this is forever, you're never getting better, and each day is going to be a torment and misery. You held fast to other people who gave you encouragement. And that's what I hope people come out of this today, to hold fast and to express to other people. I once took a friend of ours, Patricia. She was a physician's assistant. She hated me because I brought her to work in this hospital, and then I cut the salaries of the other two docs, and so she was the only doc there, so she was mad at me. I'll finish.
Go ahead.
And she saw this man who had been repetitively suicidal. He looked miserable. I usually have a sense of hope for most people. I didn't have one for him. But she looked at him, and she said with the utmost sincerity, "And how are you today?" And you could see his whole being flip into presence and caring. His whole suicidal attitude just melted in the face of her genuine care and concern. And so to emphasize again what you say.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
You know, that brings to mind once again that this is Neighbor Month. And Barry, I wonder, or if any of you know of cultures where the sense of community is stronger, and if that helps to mitigate or keep the incidences of suicide down.
Had life gone properly, I would have grown up in the shtetl, and there wouldn't have been many, there would have been lots of annoyances, but having the empty loneliness that people have would be missable entirely within the community.
Bill, you said you were thinking about suicide at age 8? You were depressed. What might have helped you?
That uncommon. I mean, I know it freaks out the general population, but in my circles, it's not that uncommon for people to have been depressed at a young age.
So is this one of the common denominators you find among people who have tried to commit suicide?
It's people can have thoughts of suicide from young ages because their situations are difficult, and suicide is a solution out of a problem when there doesn't seem to be another one. But it's an attempt to get past the misery in some way or another. There are children who do attempt suicide, but it's not nearly so common as for adults and older people.
And I wonder, is it is it really a desire to die? Or what is the desire? What is it that is attractive about taking your own life?
I think it's
Yeah, I
Bill
can jump in
knows.
on that one as
Yeah.
well from a lived experience perspective and from talking to a lot of people. It's just as a desire to escape the pain of existing,
Right.
what's going on in your mind and in your body, and you feel trapped and like you just want to escape what seems like an eternal hell, essentially. I mean, that's maybe overstating the case, but it's an escape, a wish.
What might have helped you? What might have kept you from attempting to take your life?
Well,
Bill?
I think if I had gotten treatment, if I had been not ashamed to admit what was going on with me, and then if earlier I would have talked about it, and then if I had gotten treatment because I wasn't afraid of the stigma or of being a person who had this thing, so I could have, that's what would really would have helped the most. And both of those things I think are byproducts of stigma. Very much. If you're going to be a successful person in this world, you're told you can't have these kinds of flaws because people will judge you and you're not going to be as good. That's not true, but that's what I believed. And so I didn't talk about it. And when I did, because it was unhideable, I didn't get treatment because I was going to solve it myself. And neither of those things worked.
Yeah, statistically, men succeed at suicide more frequently than women, though women attempt it more frequently.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is, Barry?
I don't know, men are conditioned to do violent things, and I think a lot of suicidal people shoot themselves. I think about half of the suicides in America are from gunshot wounds. But I had a point, but I forgot in the glare of the
Guns.
lights. So
Yeah, guns. Well, there's a vote for gun laws. We are now at the point where we can take questions from our viewing audience, and I have a few right here. If I know someone who lost their job and they seem to be struggling, they seem more sad and withdrawn than usual, should I say something to them? Who wants to answer that? Barry?
So, yeah, say something. It's well known and well studied that asking whether a person is suicidal doesn't put the idea in their head. I asked a depressed teenager a while ago who was telling me this litany of sorrows. I asked her if she was suicidal, and she laughed and said, "Oh, no." And I felt greatly relieved. Always ask. It's not going to, the answer can only be helpful. They did a study, this is what I wanted to say, a number of years ago, that people who had 10 sessions of therapy, it doesn't matter whether it was CBT or other kinds of therapy, people who had therapy were, the beneficial effects of that on preventing suicide, and I think the effect was enormous. It was like 90%, lasted for decades. The investment in going to therapy when you have trouble lasts way much longer than the time of the depression.
So addressing the situation
Yeah.
directly. John, you have some thoughts about that.
Well, Susan, I was just going to ask you, I mean, have you ever asked a friend or a family member who looked depressed to you whether they were thinking of suicide?
I actually have, yes.
So you know how difficult, that's a tough question.
It's a tough conversation.
First time you ever ask someone, I think it's not so, it's a little different on this side of the stethoscope when you're working with a patient. But if it's a family member or a friend who, where you're concerned, that first time can be hard. But it's such an important question to ask. And I think another way to look at it is if they end up killing themselves and you didn't ask, then how are you going to feel about that? And so I just think if, you may not have another opportunity. And so it's, even though it can be a hard question to ask, you need to ask it.
Yeah, tough conversation, but Bill, would you have welcomed something like that?
You know, I'm not sure that people didn't know. They just didn't know what to do in that particular case. I think, yeah, so, yeah, I would have been fine answering it. I don't know. I don't know. Looking, it's so many years back now that I've been in that mindset. It's hard for me to really relate.
That's good to know.
Yeah, yeah.
Good you're not there. Yeah. Okay, and this kind of goes to what you were saying, John. This next question is there a right way to have a conversation about suicide? Is there a right way to do it?
I can answer that.
Barry?
Yes, awkwardly,
Yeah.
but do it.
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, everything I do is awkward. For me, it's no big deal. But it's not a comfortable question to ask of a friend. I've done that. It seems awkward, but do it anyway. There's no smooth way to really do it. And doing it awkwardly is both caring and charming.
John, you alluded to asking that question as a physician, and is it easier to ask the question, have the conversation as a physician, or as a loving friend? Which is the more awkward conversation?
Oh, I can say, you know, it's a question that I ask not infrequently in the emergency room. So, and of course there, you know, we're part of a team, so if I have someone, and I kind of work through the review of systems, and I get to the behavioral health section, and I ask a series of questions. So it's all pretty formulaic. And if, you know, those turn up positive, then I walk a short distance into to talk to the psychiatric social worker, who then, you know, will connect with the psychiatry team. So we're set up to handle that. If it's a friend, it's a totally different setting. I mean, it's like
A couple small things you can do if it's a friend. One is, as you've both been mentioning, listen, right? Actually care about them and listen, as you want to establish some sense of caring. And the other is, if you have personally had those thoughts, or you know somebody who has, bring a personal experience into it, me or my brother or my uncle, and that will make them feel more at ease as well.
Right.
Yeah, that's giving permission. That's great, Bill. We do have a question here. What are some recommendations for how to support someone who has lost a loved one to suicide? That's a tough one. John, you might have more experience with this.
Well, you know, what we did with Debbie and Stuart was, you know, we actually wrote up a healing plan. I mean, it just, it was, you know, it was really, those just horrible days, and, you know, trying to put people's lives back together as best you could. And it just seemed to, you know, I guess just the internist in me, you know, what's the problem, what's the plan, you know, putting together the plan, a healing plan. So working with them and with the family. And I even called Cameron's psychiatrist, you know, to be part of that effort. So that was one thing. I think just, you know, support and love. I mean, it can be, for survivors of suicide, this, you know, can be such an incredibly difficult time, and potentially a very isolating time. And,
Oh, yeah.
And to reach out. I know that Debbie and Stuart had secret Santas. You know, they'd come home, and I'm sure around Christmas, you know, holidays, anniversaries can be really tough for survivors of suicide. And, you know, I know sometimes they came home and there would be gifts on the doorsteps, you know, just very, very touching. So there are many things that people can do to support those who have lost someone to suicide.
Bill, I bet you have some
I would
thoughts on
interject,
this.
yeah, I would add that there are community resources available to connect with other people who have lost somebody to suicide through organizations like Forefront or NAMI, or a lot of different ways that people can find to connect with others who have dealt with loss, who may have some guidance or just support and connection.
That connection thing keeps coming up, and I'm so happy to hear that, and I'm hoping that our audience is hearing that, because ours is a culture, particularly now, that does not foster human connection, that does not say it's okay to have problems and you can talk with other people about them. So thank you for pushing that.
And I want to thank John. John's a good doc. Dr. Osborne's a good doc. 90% of people who attempt suicide will have seen a physician. Only 40% of them will have seen a psychiatrist beforehand. So it's really important for all the physicians who are out there who may be listening to this to make this part of the regular routine. Also, the fact that you invited the psychiatrist in. For a psychiatrist to lose a patient, the trauma is like losing a mother or a father on the stress scales.
Oh.
So
Yeah,
it's a black hole. It's hard to get any kind of light out of.
Yeah, I want to just pick up on something Bill
Go ahead,
said.
Jim.
I think, there are nonprofit organizations like Forefront and NAMI who are tremendous resources for our community. So I've had the opportunity to work with Jen Stuber and also Marnie Lombard, both who have been leaders and are leaders in suicide prevention and have been there.
Well, and I believe a part of the suicide prevention plan that VashonBePrepared and their partners are going to run in the next month includes training for physicians.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll get to that. We have another question here. When you're having that awkward conversation, how do you know how serious they are?
So you ask how long have been thinking about it. Are you able to sleep? Have you made any plans? Do you have, what are your plans? Do you have the ability to pull this off? I mean, there are steps that people go through when they're first thinking about suicide, then they're thinking more seriously about suicide, and somewhere along the line, the fantasy of suicide starts merging into planning. And if it keeps going.
Well, and when we look at the LEARN program, I think that both the E, which is empathize and listen, and the A, which is ask directly about suicide, kind of run together. So when you ask that question, presumably,
Right.
when you get into that awkward conversation, empathize, listen. I think listening is one of the best ways we love one another,
Yeah.
we humans. And it also says remain calm and offer compassion, avoid judgment or advice. When in doubt, just listen. Empathize, this must be so hard for you. And I think you mentioned this, Barry, asking the question directly is not going to put suicide in the mind of the person. They're not going to take their own lives because you asked them if they were thinking about it. The likelihood is it's going to take them away from that idea because someone is listening to their pain. So asking those questions of how long have you been thinking about this and do you have the means, that's a scary part. Here's another question. My friend has been gloomy and withdrawn for months, but this week she is all of a sudden happier and talkative. Should I trust this new happy mood is real?
Bill, you want to take that
Bill?
one?
Well, moods tend to shift a lot for me and people I know who live with mental health conditions. So, and it's easy, well, it's easy to think that, oh, I've shifted and now everything's going to be, good forever. I think that you don't have to trust it. You can enjoy that it's there. And I can't say with this individual whether it will be there. It could be that they went through something and now they'll just be in a good space forever going forward. There's no telling one way or the other with this amount of information, but that's a good thing. I'm glad they're better.
So sometimes
yeah.
people come to the decision to kill themselves and they're relieved and they're in a much better mood because they've already made the decision. So you have to ask what's going on.
So apparently you would be observing a pretty dramatic shift in
I'd be
Yeah.
worried,
Yeah.
but then I worry.
We're gonna go a little further with questions, but I want to mention the program that our team will be using during the coming weeks, and that is the LEARN program, which was developed at an organization called Forefront at University of Washington. And LEARN is an acronym, and Barry, would you help us go through these letters and what they mean in terms of suicide prevention?
You could probably do a better job of it than me, but
I can read. Yeah.
okay, I can.
Okay, so the L is look for signs, and we
listen.
mentioned those before.
Look
Yeah.
and listen for signs and observe. E, you give your heart out to the person and you empathize. You ask directly about it. And if there's any immediate dangers, you take those away. I've had a person come in to my office planning his suicide who had a gun. He swore to me he wouldn't. He was of a good character. So many people who are suicidal are, and he brought his gun in to remove the danger. I didn't have him go any further other than have him come with his family to be seeing me and wrap him around with caring and concern. But he removed the gun, which really frightened the hell out of me.
Oh, yeah, that would be nervous.
Yeah.
Right. But that brings us to the R, which we haven't talked a lot about,
Right.
and that is remove the danger, lock up weapons, limit access to medications. And are there instructions for that? Are there places where people can go to find out just how they can best secure their firearms? And what drugs are more likely to be used for suicide attempts?
So one of the things that psychiatrists have been doing, they've been using serotonin reuptake inhibitors as the primary antidepressant, not because they're more effective. They're not even as effective as some of the old tricyclics were. But the old tricyclics could be used lethally, and the serotonin reuptake inhibitors aren't. You can't use those so lethally. So the whole profession has shifted into a safer kind of medication category. That is in some ways locking up the dangerous meds to use with depressed people.
So I need to clarify. Are you saying that serotonin inhibitors can be used lethally?
No.
Okay.
Serotonin inhibitors you can take a huge dose of those and
Okay. You'd get
you're
really
still okay.
sick.
Yeah.
Right. And where do people go, do you know, John, to find out the best way to lock up their firearms? Who's got that information, or is that available at any gun selling store?
I don't, do you know, Barry?
My relationship with the guns is quite distant.
I know a lot of people who are very active on that, and I don't know a website, but I know if they go to Forefront, Forefront is really big on that, and they will find resources at the Forefront website. So,
And that website is forefront, or at theforefront.com or .org. And we'll find out exactly what that is.
Oh, she's got a computer. Oh.
Yeah, she's got a computer over there. The last letter in the acronym, the LEARN acronym, is N, the next level of care.
Right.
What do you do next?
So, this is something that John encourages everybody to do and did from the first, and I encourage it too, is to have this suicide prevention line in your cell phone, which is 800-273-8225, or the crisis text line, and there's always somebody monitoring that, is text HEAL to number 741-741.
And let me just correct, the phone number is 1-800-273-8255. That's 273-TALK for the suicide prevention line. And when a person texts HEAL to 741-741, they will get an immediate response. And I think that's particularly helpful to teens who tend to use texting more than anything else.
One of the things I started doing with people who were coming to me just depressed is starting from the first that people who are depressed often come to me believing that their family would be better off without them. And before a person even says a word, I say that's never true. If that's a common delusion that people have when they are depressed, but it's never true. The injury to family is incalculable and is multi-generational. I had this one kid come into me after his brother had killed himself. He was depressed, he was suicidal, and I told him that if he were also, and he wanted to kill himself, he wanted to jump off the same bridge his brother did. I said, if you did that, you'd be putting the final nail in your family's coffin, because somewhere, somehow, someone later is gonna be reacting to that suicide, and there's gonna be a much greater likelihood that suicide will be passed on into your family. And if you do nothing, if you just endure your own pain, you're not passing it on to anybody, and you're protecting your family. Even if nobody knows about it, you will. You protect your family by keeping your own pain and not alleviating it, by passing it on through the generations. So I just want to pass that on too.
That, I think the bottom line being that no one wants to lose you. Your family would be horribly harmed if you decided to take your own life.
Absolutely.
And they would be harmed for a long term.
Right.
John or Bill, would you like to chime in on any of that?
I'll just add real quickly, I thought that was really well put, and I appreciated that, so thank you. And the degree to which it is real, that you can believe people are better off without you, is hard to describe. So the more you reinforce it, the better, because it seems as real as gravity to a person. At least from my lived experience, I can't speak somebody who's really depressed. It seems just unquestionable.
John, your thoughts on that? The impact on the family?
Well, I remember my dad, not long, again, Cameron died just a couple months before my dad died. He was in hospice, and my dad was just, really struggled with this, do we have depression in our family? Are people at risk in my family of suicide? It was really tough for him. So I think that one of the challenges is for people who are struggling with suicidal ideation is to step beyond themselves and understand, the potential ramifications for the entire family. So it can be a real challenge if you're if you're struggling, if you're deep in depression and you think that suicide is your only way out. You're in so much pain.
It's not.
It's not.
And we are coming to the end of our evening, folks. Any final comments from any of you? Barry?
Well, my passion in this regard has to do with my dad, who regretted being alive when everybody in his family that he loved had been killed. And I know that he stayed alive for me. I don't know if he would have taken his life, but he sure didn't like having to live it with what he had to live with. But I'm very grateful for his caring enough to endure. And I think that we find meaning. Sometimes we don't know where we're going to find meaning, but we find meaning. The way Bill has taken his own pain and turned it into healing for so many other people, and the way John has too. And it's just, we find meaning, and usually we find meaning in helping each other, neighbors helping neighbors.
It's Neighbor Month, yes.
Yes.
Bill, final comments.
Thank you all for putting this event on. My comment is really just that it's possible, if you're really, really in a dark, depressed state, consider the possibility that it's just something happening in your mind and not in the broader world around you. And listen to Barry and John. What they're saying makes a lot of sense.
And connect with somebody.
Connection is so helpful.
Yeah. John, final comments?
Well, 1-800-273-8255. I think that, we're coming into a mental health crisis like we've never seen before. And one of the reasons that our Medical Reserve Corps' community care team has moved forward with this and other efforts is because we recognize that we are at risk as a community, as an island community, and the opportunity we have is to develop a model here that we can export and provide to communities across the region and across the country, and we're doing that. But in the end, we really are neighbors taking care of neighbors, and we have to put things together here at home. We have to put our house in order given what's coming.
Thank you. Thank you all so very much. And tonight's presentation, folks, is just the beginning of the suicide prevention campaign that the Medical Reserve Corps, VashonBePrepared, and the community care team are going to be implementing for the next several weeks. They're going to use the LEARN acronyms, the LEARN method, and you too can learn about that, pun intended. And you can also find out more about it at the website where LEARN was developed at intheforefront.org. That's INTHEFOREFRONT.org. They have a whole lot of answers and information there for you. Today's presentation is recorded. It will be available at the Vashon Center for the Arts.org website and on the Voice of Vashon.org website. And probably the most important message I want to leave with you right now, if you are thinking of taking your own life or you're concerned about a loved one who might be in that position, use that phone number, 800-273-8255. It's 800-273-TALK. It's the Suicide Prevention Lifeline. It is there for you 24/7. If you're a veteran, call that number and then press 1. It is also available to Spanish-speaking people at 1-800-628-9454. 1-800-628-9454. And for those of you who prefer to text, just text the letters HEAL to 741-741. And if there's any immediate danger, just call 911. I want to thank our panelists for your observations, for your candor, your beautiful stories, for connecting with folks and giving you all the permission to say, I hurt. And many thanks to you and our audience for your attention and for your commitment to preventing suicide in our community. I wish you all good health, mental and physical, and think about your neighbors this month. Thank you.